It was midwinter, as the year 1691 became 1692, when a pair of girls started acting very strangely. The girls were cousins who happened to live in the same household, one being the daughter and the other the niece of the Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister who led the Puritan congregation in Salem Village, Massachusetts. The odd behavior was first noticed in the Reverend's young daughter, Elizabeth, or Betty Parris, who was only 9 years old at the time. Little Betty started staring off into space for long stretches, as if in a hypnotic trance. This soon evolved into even more distressing episodes, where she would crawl around the floor on all fours, bark like a dog, and make strange, choking sounds. Soon, her older cousin, the 13-year-old Abigail Williams, started exhibiting the same bizarre behaviors. A contemporary observer, one Robert Califf, would record that Betty and Abigail, quote, began to act in a strange and unusual manner by getting into holes, creeping under chairs and stools, and to use sundry odd postures and antic gestures, uttering foolish, ridiculous speeches which neither they themselves nor any other could make sense of. End quote. Ugh. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of a little girl in a dissociative state getting into a hole or creeping under a chair, just squatting there, babbling. As might be expected, the girl's parents were deeply disturbed by all of this, so they called a local physician to come and examine Betty and Abigail. The doctor, usually identified as Dr. William Griggs, carefully evaluated the two girls and found nothing physiologically wrong with them. In his mind, there could only be one explanation for their odd behavior. They must be, quote, under an evil hand, end quote. These girls were bewitched. Some member of the community, using powers granted to him or her by the devil, was tormenting these children. The Reverend Parris first turned to his faith to try and heal his girls. He called in ministers from neighboring communities and organized group prayers to hopefully fortify the souls of these unfortunate children and drive away the evil spirits who were torturing them. Soon, many in the community were participating in public prayers and penitent group fasts in the hope that God might find it in his wisdom to relieve these children. But these sincere efforts seemed to have no effect. In fact, even more distressingly, the enchantment seemed to be spreading. Soon, other teenage girls, friends who had been close with Betty and Abigail, started taking on the same strange behaviors. First, the girls' neighbors and playmates, Ann Putnam Jr. and Betty Hubbard, became similarly cursed. One eyewitness would describe them being, quote, taken dumb, their mouths stopped, their throats choked, their limbs racked and tormented, end quote. This malignant witchcraft seemed to be spreading like a contagion among the young female residents of Salem Village. As winter turned to spring, 5 other girls, aged between 12 and 19 years old, became gripped by the same evil force. Before this episode had concluded, roughly 70 individuals from Salem Village claimed that they had been the victims of a supernatural attack. The Reverend Parris, frustrated by his fruitless spiritual efforts and growing increasingly worried that his entire community was being corrupted by Satan himself, started questioning the girls about who was behind this sorcery. The girls were unsure at first, but after repeated rounds of interrogation, they started naming names. There were witches in Salem, and these girls knew who they were. It started small. Perhaps it was Tituba, the enslaved indigenous woman in the Paris household who had been behind this evil magic. Or perhaps it was two other local women, Sarah Good, a poor woman prone to petty conflict with her neighbors, who was forced to live off of charity, and Sarah Osborne, a woman tied up in litigation over the inheritance of her farm, who had not attended church in 3 years. The three women first accused of witchcraft were all outcasts in their own specific way. In many ways, they fit the typical profile for a witch in colonial New England. But the afflicted children, as the accusing teenagers became known, soon started reporting that they were being spiritually tormented by a great number of people. To use the language of the time, the girls started to cry out against people from many different walks of life. If these girls were to be believed, Salem, and indeed most of New England, was rank with witches. Clearly, a court needed to be convened to properly mete out justice to all of those who were in league with Satan. By the time everything had run its course, around 200 people had been publicly accused of witchcraft. Just over 150 of those accused were jailed. Ultimately, 19 people were convicted and publicly hung as witches. 5 more died while in custody, and in one remarkable case, an accused man was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. What started as a strange household incident somehow had become a once-in-a-generation crisis that spread well beyond the borders of Salem Village and threatened to completely destabilize the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Just based on the numbers of the accused and executed, Salem was a relatively minor event compared to some of the more audacious European witch hunts. For instance, between the years 1625 and 1631 in the German city of Würzburg, 157 men, women, and children were executed as witches, with an estimated 900 more being put to death in the nearby countryside. In the 1580s, 368 convicted witches were executed in the city of Trier. In the Holy Roman Electorate of Cologne, a witch hunt that peaked during the 1630s is estimated to have taken the lives of over 2,000 accused witches. And yet, somehow, at least in the English-speaking world, Cologne is best remembered for men's perfume, whereas Salem remains synonymous with witchcraft. The Salem Witch Crisis of 1692 was not history's earliest, latest, longest, or most deadly witch hunt, and yet it's somehow become the most iconic. This occurred despite early efforts by prominent New Englanders to whitewash or even cover up this disturbing moment in the history of Massachusetts. But the Salem Witch Trials simply left too big an impact on the colony and the future United States to be easily swept under the rug. Historians, authors, playwrights, psychologists, and lovers of the occult keep being drawn to the remarkable events of 1692. After over 3 centuries of analysis, most experts agree on what happened in Salem, but few agree on why it happened. In some ways, the Salem Witch Trials were typical of most witch hunts of the era, but in other ways, they were quite different. Rarely did 17th century witch hunts end with the widespread recognition that something went wrong, things spiraled out of control, and many innocent people had paid the price. Trying to make sense of a historical event so steeped in fear, paranoia, and the vagaries of group psychology can be a difficult task. But where there is fear, paranoia, and vagary, you can bet there are going to be some historical myths. So let's start picking it apart today on Our Fake History. episode number 187, What Bewitched Salem, Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone listening that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and check out the level of support that feels good for you. If you support at $5 a month, you will get access to an ad-free feed and all the exclusive extra episodes made just for the patrons. Quick reminder to patrons, keep sending me your suggestions for what you would like the next patrons-only extra episode to be on. I have got a ton of great suggestions already, but I thought I would give the rest of you a chance to throw your hat in the ring before I choose my top 5 favorites, and the voting begins. This week, we are embarking on a new trilogy of episodes on a topic that has been on my list for quite a long time. Now, you know me. I don't usually like to get too seasonal with the topics on this show. I worry that it puts too much of a timestamp on the episodes, and I like for these to be evergreen. But this year, I'm leaning into spooky season and indulging in something appropriately October feeling. We are turning our attention to the late 1600s and the colonial settlement of Salem, Massachusetts. This, of course, was the setting of one of history's best remembered witchcraft panics. The Salem Witchcraft Trials of 1692-1693 have by far become the most famous event to ever occur in that particular corner of Massachusetts. In pop culture, the name Salem has become synonymous with witchcraft. Now, longtime fans of the podcast know that one of my obsessions is mining history for cool-sounding band names. Well, the name Salem has become a favorite for artists trying to evoke a witchy, creepy aesthetic. Based on my rudimentary search, there are at least 6 notable bands called Salem. This includes the Michigan-based band Salem, who pioneered a sound that's been called witch house, kind of got big in the early 2010s. My favorite spin on the Salem name might be the obscure 70s heavy psych band Salem Mass, whose first and only album was, appropriately or not, called Witch Burning. I like the double meaning of mass in that name. Very clever, guys. And by the way, before we get too far away from it, I think the best band name suggested by the whole Salem Witch episode is The Afflicted Children. If you're starting an eyeliner-heavy goth band, please call yourself The Afflicted Children. But beyond the world of music, the Salem Witchcraft Pop Culture Association is everywhere. Fans of cheesy 90s TV might remember that Sabrina the Teenage Witch had a talking black cat, of course, named Salem. Now, from what I understand, the current town of Salem, Massachusetts has fully embraced its witchy reputation. Today, the town is home to the Salem Witch Museum, the Witch Dungeon Museum, the Salem Witch House, the International Monster Museum, and a long list of shops selling magical objects, modern witchcraft supplies, and occult paraphernalia. This is to say nothing of the remarkable list of witch-themed, ghost-themed, or straight-up Satan-themed walking tours on offer in Salem. If you're planning to do some witch-themed tourism, you could do a whole lot worse than visiting Salem, Massachusetts. In a delicious twist of historical irony, a panic based on purging all the witches from Salem created a situation where a few hundred years later, witchcraft has become an essential part of the town's local economy. I think I can hear the town's Puritan fathers turning in their graves. But as I mentioned in the introduction, Salem's enduring association with the witch trials is a little curious, if only because other locales that happen to be the settings for bigger, more deadly witch hunts have not been as permanently marked by that experience. In other words, why is it that witchy-sounding bands want to call themselves Salem and not Cologne? Well, I think there are a few possible explanations for this. First, the Salem Witch Trials were documented with a thoroughness that is not always common in that era. Whatever your opinions may be of the Puritans of New England, you have to admit that they were good record keepers. Thanks to the Protestant emphasis on being able to read the Bible for oneself, the New England Puritans were especially literate. In fact, it's been guessed that the Massachusetts Bay Colony had an adult male literacy rate approaching 100%. That is remarkable for any time or place, let alone the 17th century. An exceptionally literate society is a society that's going to be producing lots of writing. The more sources we have, the more clearly a specific historical event comes into focus. I think this is one of the reasons that the Salem Witch Trials have been an event that authors, historians, and amateur sleuths like to return to. There's lots of material to explore and evaluate. But that doesn't fully explain it. There are other witch trials that have been well documented. Another possibility is the role these trials play in American history. The fact that this event happened in colonial America might help explain its continued notoriety. American historians and media makers have been very effective at elevating the importance of American stories, and then broadcasting that importance to the rest of the world. This witch trial has been given the full attention of the American historical media machine, which is not the case with places like Würzburg or Trier, Germany. Further, the Salem Witch Trials have been pointed to as an important turning point in American colonial history. In the early 20th century, American historians like George Lincoln Burr argued that the Salem Witch Trials were the event that ultimately ended the dominance of the Puritans in New England. In Burr's estimation, the Salem trials fatally wounded the credibility of early America's would-be theocrats. This paved the way for the ideals of the Enlightenment to take hold in the American colonies, which was a direct precursor for the American Revolution and a constitution that guaranteed religious freedom. Burr would write dramatically that, quote, Salem witchcraft was the rock on which the theocracy shattered, end quote. Now, over the course of this series, I'm hoping to test just how well that interpretation has aged. But suffice it to say that for generations of American historians, Salem was regarded as a turning point. This, of course, is going to help Salem's brand recognition. Next, as I hinted at earlier, the Salem Witch Trials have a huge pop culture footprint. The first novel based on the 1692 witchcraft crisis was 1828's Rachel Dyer by the American author John Neal. Though not a huge hit in its day, the novel was notable for making the Salem Witch Trials a popular setting for works of historical fiction that would come after. Without a doubt, the most consequential piece of fiction written about the trials was Arthur Miller's critically lauded 1953 play, The Crucible. Written as an allegory for McCarthyism during the anti-communist panic of the era, the play won the 1953 Tony for Best Play and has gone on to be regarded as one of the essential works of American drama. The Crucible has been the source material for a number of films and has even inspired an opera by the same name. To this day, high school students study The Crucible. I remember studying it when I was in high school, and I have taught it as a high school teacher. Now, it's possible that before 1953, Salem, Massachusetts may have been able to redefine itself as something distinct from its witchy history. But after the success of the Crucible, that became considerably more difficult for the town. At least, that's my theory. Arthur Miller had made sure that a whole new generation of people would not forget what went down in Salem in 1692. However, it's worth noting that Miller took a number of liberties when writing The Crucible. The play works brilliantly as an allegory, but it isn't necessarily the most historically accurate depiction of the Salem trials. Miller's play also presents a very specific interpretation of the event, including an explanation for the odd behavior of the afflicted children and the actions of a number of the key players. I would argue that the interpretation of the Salem Witch Trials presented in The Crucible has affected the popular understanding of this event ever since. When it comes to picking through the fake history associated with Salem, one cannot overlook the impact of The Crucible. And believe me, we will be getting into it. Finally, I would argue that the Salem witch crisis has become the best remembered witch hunt because it's a remarkably complex historical event that just begs for a new analysis every few years. As I hope I can illustrate in this series, there's a lot going on in the Salem Witch Trials. There are multiple phenomena operating on top of each other during the peak of this crisis. First is the riddle of the strange behavior of the little girls at the heart of this story. How do we explain what was going on with Betty Paris, the first girl to show signs of what was later determined to be witchcraft? Then there's the fact that this behavior was contagious. When the trials got underway, there were 9 preteen and teenage girls in Salem, all affected by the same strange condition. How do we explain all of them? Is this an example of what's been called mass hysteria? Is mass hysteria even a thing? But that's just the start. How then should we understand the rounds of accusations, public denunciations, and confessions? One part of this that really blows my mind is just how many people confessed to being witches in 1692. There may have been one type of group psychology functioning among these so-called afflicted girls, but another type of groupthink seems to have seized Salem during the fervor to find and execute witches. Indeed, these chaotic rounds of accusation, interrogation, and condemnation seemed to have a strange energy all their own. It's this violent process that people are referring to when they speak colloquially about a witch hunt. So there might be 2 types of group psychosis operating during the Salem witch trials. That is, if group psychosis is even a thing. It all may be just as ethereal as the witches that the Puritans thought they were chasing. On top of all of that, there are legal questions to be pondered. What makes a court an institution that ensures justice as opposed to simply an instrument of oppression? How and why did the Salem courts go astray? This is to say nothing of the gender, racial, and class politics that clearly influenced how this episode unfolded. That's what makes Salem special. It's not one strange event. It's like 5 or 6 strange events all piled on top of each other. It's also notable because almost immediately after it was over, there was a widespread recognition that it was wrong. People were pardoned en masse. The colonial government of Massachusetts would eventually pay reparations to the families of people who had been executed as witches. That sort of thing usually did not happen. After a witch hunt, there was often a sense of relief. The community usually felt confident that they killed some witches. But in this case, the opposite was true. At the end, the community was less sure about the existence of witches than ever. So, I think it's safe to say that we have a lot to unpack here. Along the way, as always, I hope to dispel some misconceptions and bust some myths, big and small, about the strangest thing to ever happen in Salem, Massachusetts. We've got lots to cover here, so buckle up. This is going to be a trilogy. And today's episode is going to be mostly background. So get your background hats on. Okay, let's start by indulging in a brief history of witch hunting, to hopefully put the events of 1692 in the appropriate historical context. We should start this exploration by first pinning down what a witch even is. Or rather, what a witch was perceived to be by the Puritan residents of New England in the late 17th century. To do this, I'm going to be making a lot of use of a book called The Enemy Within, A Short History of Witch Hunting by the historian John Putnam Demos. Demos is regarded as one of the foremost experts on witch hunting and is the author of a number of essential books on the topic, including Entertaining Satan, which is a hugely influential study on the Salem Witch Trials. I'm going to be quoting from him quite a bit in this section, so I thought I better start by giving him a robust shout out. Big ups, Professor Putnam Demos. First, it needs to be said that the belief in magic, that is, using supernatural means to affect our physical reality, is basically universal. Almost every culture on the planet has a belief in something that could be broadly understood as magic. In most cultures, there's also usually a distinction between what I'm going to call light magic and dark magic. Light magic usually takes the form of good luck charms, love potions, spells meant to help conception or improve business, magical blessings of all kinds. Magic that helps. Dark magic, on the other hand, is magic that harms. This could be something as simple as the evil eye, or as elaborate as a curse that could kill livestock or end a life. In Europe, the dark form of magic became broadly known by its Latin name, maleficium. Now, of course, around the world, different cultures conceived of witches somewhat differently, but we're going to focus on the European witch, as that's the one that our Puritan friends in Salem were most concerned with. For Europeans, a witch was a wielder of maleficium. In pre-Christian times, the practice of what would have been considered magic by later Europeans was intertwined with the polytheistic religions practiced at the time. Greek, Roman, Germanic, and Celtic cultures all had their own practices for divining the future and invoking the supernatural. But as Christianity spread through the continent, the border between what was religion and what was magic slowly became more strictly defined. But I think it should be emphasized that this was a slow process. The Old Testament, which of course was inherited from the Jewish faith, famously contained a number of passages that seemed to explicitly forbid sorcery and witchcraft. The book of Exodus proclaimed that, quote, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," end quote. Similarly, the book of Leviticus commanded that, quote, A man or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them." End quote. God, I love that King James translation of the Bible. They shall stone them with stones. But historian John Demos has pointed out that in late antique and early medieval Europe, these passages were broadly interpreted as condemning maleficium, that is, dark magic, and not all types of magic. In fact, Demos has pointed out that light magic folk traditions thrived in Europe for centuries alongside Christianity. In many parts of the continent, it was common to find magic specialists working out in the open for the betterment of the community. Apparently, in Britain, these people were sometimes referred to as the Cunning Folk. And I know this episode has already been heavy on the band name content, but if you're starting a group that features a mandolin prominently, then please consider calling yourself the Cunning Folk. Anyway, the Cunning Folk were usually folk healers, fortune tellers, purveyors of lucky charms and fertility medicines. I can't help but think of the Miracle Max and his wife in Princess Bride.
Get back, witch!
I'm not a witch, I'm your wife! But after what you just said, I'm not even sure I want to be that anymore!
You never had it so good.
Those who know. Anyway, John Demos explains that, quote, Christianity's relation to all this was ambivalent. Tolerance, not to say complicity, was frequently the norm. Individual priests might even double as conjurers, dispensing what were essentially magical remedies alongside their regular parish ministrations. End quote. Now, this would eventually change, but I think it's worth noting that for many centuries, magic traditions lived comfortably alongside mainstream Christianity. Now, this may be one of the biggest myths about witch hunts. There is a belief that witch hunting was especially prevalent in the so-called Dark Ages, or the early medieval period. The thinking goes that the further back you go in time, the more superstitious and primitive our ancestors become. If witch hunting is the height of superstitious thinking, it only follows that it was more common in earlier times. This is completely untrue. First, this is based on the flawed premise that quote-unquote Western civilization has somehow been evolving steadily from darkness to light from the fall of Rome up to now. We've litigated that Whiggish misconception a million times on this podcast, and hopefully I've proven to you by this point that that's just not how history works. As it turns out, in the early medieval period in Western Europe, a time that has been maligned as a so-called Dark Age, witch hunting was not especially common. Sorry, Monty Python steered you wrong on this one. While not unheard of, witch hunts were exceedingly rare in that period, and European Christians were decidedly less concerned with the corrupting influence of dark magic on their society at that time. Somewhat counterintuitively, the era when witch hunting really exploded is the period that commonly gets called the Renaissance. Yes, that period in European history that's been celebrated as a rebirth of learning, a time defined by a new emphasis on reason and rationality and huge leap forwards in science and art. That is when witch hunting reached its bloody climax. European witch hunting really picked up steam in the 1500s, reached a zenith in the 1600s, and didn't fully peter out until the mid-1700s. Some historians like to call this era the early modern period, and that is when the big witch hunts happened, which puts the Salem incident right near the peak of the phenomenon. Now, in the past, we've explored on this podcast whether or not the terms Dark Ages and Renaissance are misleading. Well, one huge piece of evidence that can be used to blow up the traditional conception of the dark Middle Ages followed by an enlightened Renaissance are the statistics concerning witch hunts. The phenomenon called the witch craze by some historians is a decidedly early modern event. Now, this is not to say that there was no witch hunting in the early Middle Ages. Records show that there were people who were punished and sometimes killed for allegedly practicing dark magic. However, usually these witch hunts were small in scope and did not presume a massive conspiracy with the devil. During the centuries when Christianity was still spreading, it was common for Christian chroniclers and hagiographers, that is, the people documenting saints' lives, to equate pagan religion with witchcraft and devil worship. You might remember from our episode on St. Patrick that the Druids and other Celtic priests in Ireland were often referred to as wizards in the medieval hagiographies. But in the early Christian period, the emphasis was on the idea that pagan belief was less powerful than the Christian faith. It was argued that pagan magic need not be feared, as it paled in comparison to the power of the Christian God. This attitude can be seen reflected in the records that survive from the reign of the famous Frankish king Charlemagne. After conquering and forcefully converting the Saxons to Christianity, the king equated any sacrifices to the old Saxon gods as akin to devil worship. He commanded that a death sentence be carried out on any, quote, pretended sorcerers, end quote, who might claim to have supernatural abilities through contact with the old gods. So this could certainly be understood as a type of witch hunt. But the notable thing is that in Charlemagne's era, that is the late 700s, it was still believed that these presumed witches or sorcerers were pretenders with no real power. The surviving documents suggest that they were undesirable only in that they were undermining Charlemagne's project of conversion, not because there was any real worry about the magic that they might wield. But as the medieval period progressed, the borders between magic and faith became more strictly enforced. In the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a growing interest among the nobility in what was known as high magic. That is, a type of light magic inspired by classical texts that was approached almost like a science. Alchemy and astrology fell under the umbrella of high magic. It was in this period, in the face of challenges from many literate and learned men who saw nothing inherently sinful in high magic, that the Catholic Church made a more definitive ruling on the matter. The Church Fathers rejected any distinction between a type of permissible high magic and an undesirable low magic. John Demos sums it up like this, quote, Church leaders fervently reasserted the diabolical grounding of magic in all forms. The entire tradition of patristic writing was united around this theme: magic as superstition, magic as subversion, magic as sacrilege. End quote. After the 12th century, as far as the religious authorities were concerned, there was no light magic. There was religion and there was sacrilege. Now, ironically, this line in the sand also coincided with a growing belief in the power of the devil to act in the physical world. All magic was diabolical, which ironically meant that all magic could potentially work and needed to be taken seriously as a threat. Over the course of the medieval era, the popular understanding of Satan had evolved from him being a notable but fairly minor biblical character to becoming understood as an implacable adversary seeking to subvert and undo God's plan on earth. A greater emphasis on a beastly, actively evil Satan was easily paired with anxieties about new breakaway religious groups that the mainstream church deemed heretical. Fringe religious movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians were accused of being secret devil worshippers. You might remember from our Knights Templar series that order was brought down among accusations of sorcery. All of this is to say that by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, you had a genuine concern about witches working in concert with Satan to subvert the true faith. The concern about witches was less focused on the specifics of folk magic and was instead part of a growing anxiety that witches were part of a satanic conspiracy. It was in the late Middle Ages, just as Europe was entering the early stages of what some have described as the Renaissance, that you start to get descriptions of the Witches' Sabbath, or the Black Sabbath.
Just like witches at black masses.
Thanks, Ozzy. The idea was that witches were transported by night to freaky nocturnal gatherings, riding on flying sticks, or, of course, broomsticks. At these meetings, it was believed that Satan himself would be in attendance. There, the witches would make a pact with the devil, renouncing Christ and promising to serve the Prince of Darkness. Often, Satan was described inscribing the names of his growing legion into an infernal book written in blood. In return, Satan would grant his minions evil powers that they could use to vex their neighbors. Often, a special mark was placed on the witch, sometimes called a witch's teat, that could be used to feed demonically controlled animals, known as familiars. You know, black cats, bats, evil dogs, classic witch stuff. The deal was then sealed with a devil's kiss, or a kiss right on the butt, or full-on intercourse with the devil. Again, I will turn to John Demos, who argues that, quote, it was the pact that transformed witchcraft from a matter of simple maleficium into apostasy and heresy, from individualized and localized sorcery into a massively generalized plot to destroy God's plan for the universe. End quote. The Witches' Sabbath was also characterized by wild sexual orgies, cannibalism, blood drinking, animal sacrifice, and the murder of babies and small children. Did these things actually happen? Probably not. But people believed that they did, and that's what mattered. As belief in the Witches' Sabbath became more common in the late medieval period, so too became witch hunting. Witch hunts start appearing more regularly in the records, starting in the 13th century, growing in the 14th and 15th centuries, and then in the 16th century, witch hunting gets taken to a whole new level, with full-scale witch panics becoming a more regular occurrence. So why then, if the belief in a satanic conspiracy of witches had existed for at least 3 centuries, why do these things accelerate so noticeably in the 16th century? Well, a number of historians, including the influential Salem researcher Marion Starkey, have argued that witch hunting, and by extension out-of-control witch panics, seem to loosely correlate with periods of social anxiety brought on by non-witch-related factors. Periods of famine, climate change, natural disasters, political strife, and warfare often set the stage for the most deadly rounds of witch hunting. All the parents out there listening, especially if you have young children, know that your kid tends to be less resilient when they're tired or hungry. A trip up the stairs, which normally wouldn't faze your kid, might trigger a meltdown if they need a nap or they're hungry. The stairs aren't really the issue. but they seem very important in the moment. Well, this theory suggests that human societies are not all that different. When people are exhausted, anxious, hungry, or all three, they tend to lash out. If the conditions are right, then one strange occurrence or bit of bad luck can spark a full-on witch panic. It's been argued that the 16th and 17th centuries saw so many witch hunts because a confluence of destabilizing factors made the era especially volatile. First, there was the massive religious upheaval of the Reformation. The Western European Church was split, and in the ensuing theological tumult, dozens of new interpretations of Christianity emerged. There was a pervasive belief among Protestants that for centuries, religious worship had been happening the wrong way, potentially damning all of those who had foolishly partaken. The Roman Catholic Church itself was perceived as a demonic institution, and the Pope a minister of Satan. Conversely, Roman Catholics believed that their former co-religionists had been corrupted by a dangerous new heresy. People were more suspicious of their neighbors than ever, and openly suspected many of them of being in league with the devil. These religious conflicts often turned violent and in many cases devolved into full-scale religious wars. War also brings its own kind of tumult. Even if you're a non-combatant, war can mean famine, deprivation, and all the indignities suffered by a population when an invading army moves through their territory. It's perhaps no surprise that Germany saw some of its most tenacious witch hunts break out during the height of the chaotic and destructive 30 Years' War. The 16th and 17th centuries happened to fall in the coldest parts of a 4-century-long period of cooling, sometimes called the Little Ice Age. This meant that in these centuries, crop failures due to a cooling climate were considerably more common. Winters were longer and harder, summers could be dry and infertile. All the disruptions that come with an unpredictable climate and extreme weather characterized these centuries. Scholars of the Salem witchcraft crisis have pointed out that the Little Ice Age peaked, or rather bottomed out, in the 1690s. In these centuries, there was a thick soup of anxiety that people were wading through. John Demos lists the ingredients in this soup as, quote, a persistent inflationary spiral and periodic depressions in trade, the start of a wrenching transition to commercial agriculture, with much resultant dislocation and dispossession for large elements of the peasantry, recurrent political turmoil, including local revolts, religious and civil wars, harsh climatological change, and epidemics of plague with accompanying famine, end quote. Now, of course, over 2 centuries, the severity of any one of those stressors is going to ebb and flow. Sometimes, and in some places, things can stabilize, even flourish. Then, at other times, and in other places, all the negative currents can converge in a torrent. It's in those times and places that you often find witchcraft panics. It's been argued, and I have to agree, that New England in the late 17th century was exactly one of those times and places. So let's take a quick break. When we return, we'll look more closely at New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the people who called it home in the 17th century. In the year 1629, the London-based Massachusetts Bay Company received a royal charter from the King of England to exploit and colonize a chunk of New England territory between the Charles and Merrimack rivers. England was just 20 years deep into its often troubled project of attempting to colonize the eastern coast of North America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was certainly not the first English colony on the continent, but it would soon distinguish itself as a unique one. The Charter of 1629 gave the colony considerable autonomy and powers of self-government. Now, on its own, that wasn't completely unusual for English colonies of this period, especially for so-called charter colonies administered by private companies. But what was somewhat unique was the fact that no meeting place was stipulated for the Massachusetts Bay Company in the charter. Often, but not always, charter companies had provisions that they needed to be headquartered in England, often specifically London or Westminster. This had the effect of keeping the charter colonies firmly tied to the mother country. The Massachusetts Charter had no such provision. Now, historians have debated if this was done purposefully by the colonists, who were eager to gain as much independence from England as possible, or if this was just an oversight that came from using a later edition of the Virginia Charter as a guide for the Massachusetts Charter. Either way, it meant that the company and the charter itself could remain in Massachusetts as opposed to England. Having a colonial constitution held in the colony itself and not England was a little unusual. It suggested a greater independence for that colony and soon became a point of pride for the colonists. Notably, the governor was not appointed by the King of England. The governor of the colony, along with the legislature, were elected by the adult male colonists, so long as they were members of an approved church. We'll come back to that. So this brings us to the colonists themselves. It's been estimated that in the 10 years between 1630 and 1640, roughly 20,000 English colonists arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The vast majority of those colonists were from a group that history has remembered as the Puritans. So, who were the Puritans? Well, that term is an imprecise label that gets used to describe a number of different groups of English Protestants. It's worth pointing out that the people who often get called Puritans did not use the term to describe themselves. In fact, it was originally used as a slur in England for groups that were seen as too rigid in their interpretation of Protestant Christianity. These people were originally Anglicans, that is, members of the Church of England, but they were inspired by the writings of the famous Swiss Protestant reformer John Calvin and wanted the Church of England to move in a more Calvinist direction. Some groups wanted to reform the Church of England, which they felt was still a little too influenced by traditional Catholicism. Other groups, known as separatists, believed that they simply had to break away from a church that they felt was not Protestant enough. These groups had many differences between them, but they were connected by a specifically rigid English take on Calvinism. They called themselves things like the godly, the professors, or the saints. But I'm going to keep using the imprecise but useful term Puritans, as it seems like most historians are fairly comfortable with it. But it's worth knowing that there were a lot of different ways to be a Puritan. Now, given the Massachusetts Bay Colony's relative autonomy, the Puritans were able to shape the legal, religious, and political character of the place in a profound way. For instance, to be able to participate in the government of the colony, one had to be a member of a Puritan-approved church. This disenfranchised anyone who was not the right kind of Christian. Even other radical Protestants, like Quakers and Anabaptists, found themselves excluded, and in some cases banished from Massachusetts. Now, one of the pervasive myths about the New England colonies is that the Pilgrims came searching for religious freedom. That sometimes gets misunderstood as an interest in religious freedom generally, and not the freedom to practice a very specific brand of Christianity with little to no tolerance for anything else. Now, the Puritans' lack of tolerance for other religions is sometimes used to explain the Salem Witch Trials. It can sometimes get assumed that the Salem witchcraft crisis unfolded specifically because the people involved were Puritans. The idea being that the New England Puritans were innately suspicious of religious difference, were especially sensitive to the possibility of witchcraft, and were therefore culturally predisposed towards this kind of panic. That's a tempting theory, but in my reading about the broader history of witch panics, I've become convinced that English Calvinist thinking, or Puritanism, was a less important ingredient in the mix than is sometimes assumed. These types of witch panics happened all over Europe. Some of the biggest witch hunts took place in the Roman Catholic parts of Europe. Some took place in Lutheran strongholds. There were all sorts of witch trials in England and Scotland. While the Christian religion was certainly a huge part of these events, no one denomination seems to have been especially prone to witch panics. In this period, the Puritans were just as witch crazy as the Roman Catholics, but not necessarily more so. As I mentioned earlier, a more important ingredient for a witch panic seems to be a widespread feeling of anxiety brought on by food insecurity, political strife, and warfare. In the early 1690s, the people of Massachusetts Bay were dealing with all three. First, it's worth understanding the turbulent political climate in New England in the late 1680s. As my deep history heads out there know, in the mid-1600s, England was consumed by a massive civil war. This led to the execution of King Charles I, the brief Commonwealth led by the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, and then eventually the restoration of the old Stuart monarchy in the 1660s. During both the chaotic days of the war and then the Puritan-friendly Cromwell regime, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was free to operate without much oversight from England. But after the Restoration, the king, our old friend, the merry monarch Charles II, sought to bring these quasi-independent colonies back under the thumb of the English government. Over the first 2 decades of Charles II's reign, there were a number of attempts to do this, but things really came to a head in 1686. In that year, Charles' successor, King James II, amalgamated a number of formerly distinct American colonies into a new entity called the Dominion of New England. In the case of Massachusetts, this meant that the beloved Charter of 1629 was revoked. The Puritan-run government was dissolved. No longer did Puritan church members get to elect a governor from their own ranks. The governor of the Dominion of New England was now appointed by the king. And the king really managed to appoint a doozy. The new governor was a man named Sir Edmund Andros, and he soon became one of the most hated men in Massachusetts. Andros was not a Puritan. He was an Anglican in the mold of James II, which, to Puritan eyes, made him basically a Catholic. Not only did Andros's tenure as governor sweep away the old institutions of representative government in Massachusetts, he also blithely did away with the Puritan theocracy. No longer could non-Puritans be excluded from the colony. All Protestant forms of worship needed to be tolerated. Even more scandalous, Andros demanded that Boston's Puritan Third Church be turned over for Church of England services, an outrage the Puritans saw as akin to the corruption of the temple in Jerusalem. Andros also imposed a number of new unpopular taxes, which were violently resisted by some of the colonists. He also reformed the land title system, which had the effect of nullifying many of the colonists' existing titles to their farmsteads. This was an equally unpopular measure that many colonists viewed as a land grab by the crown. Andros also made a number of reforms to the colonial legal system to bring it more in line with English law as it existed in the mother country. This had the effect of making it more difficult for colonists to sue each other in civil court. Before this point, legal records show that the people of Massachusetts had been especially litigious and took each other to court over all sorts of petty disputes. Now, these reforms might seem completely reasonable to a modern observer, but historian Emerson Baker has pointed out that these reforms had an unintended consequence which may have contributed to the witch trials. He's argued that the courts had been a means for colonists to settle disputes. It was a release valve for community tension. Under Andros's new system, that traditional form of conflict resolution disappeared, meaning that conflicts between neighbors were allowed to fester unresolved. For 3 years, the Massachusetts Puritans had to deal with an autocratic governor who stripped them of their traditional rights, taxed them heavily, threatened colonists' claims to their land, and, worst of all, opened the doors of the colony to heretics. All of this came to a head in 1689, when word reached Massachusetts that the king's daughter, Princess Mary, and her husband, William of Orange, were crossing the English Channel with the intention of deposing King James II. Before they even knew if Mary and William's invasion had been successful, the fed-up Puritan colonists rose up and overthrew Governor Andros. This was an act that was only later given a stamp of approval from Mary and William after they had secured the English throne. This has gone down in history as the Boston Revolt of 1689. In the direct aftermath of the Boston Revolt, the old form of government, as laid out by the Charter of 1629, was restored, and all vestiges of the old Andros regime were swept away. The Puritans were back in charge, but for how long was an open question. A new charter for the colony needed to be negotiated with these new English monarchs. It was deeply unclear whether or not this Puritan restoration in Massachusetts was going to last. So, in the direct lead-up to the Salem Witch Trials, the Puritans had just spent 3 years in the political wilderness, stripped of their traditional power and privilege. Their theocracy had been broken. But then, for a brief moment between 1689 and the arrival of a new governor and a new charter in 1692, the Puritans were back in charge. It's not nothing that the Salem witch crisis began while the people of Massachusetts were waiting to receive their new charter. The balance of power in the colony was about to be redefined. On top of all of that, thanks to horrid weather brought on by the coldest years of the Little Ice Age, the colony was at its least productive agriculturally. For a long time, Massachusetts had been an exporter of food to other English colonies. In the late 1680s and the early 1690s, it became an importer. This was interpreted by some Puritan reverends as proof that the reign of Andros had put the colony out of God's favor. To hopefully get back into God's grace, the provisional government revived some of the colony's most draconian laws concerning public morality. In 1690, the provisional government issued a call for a colony-wide moral reformation to combat the, quote, corruption of manners attended with inexcusable degeneracy and apostasies found among too many of these people, end quote. To that end, old colonial laws forbidding blasphemy, cursing, gambling, and Sabbath breaking were to be enforced with a new vigor. There was a real anxiety that the colony had been corrupted during the governorship of Andros, and now the sin needed to be purged from the body politic. Finally, on top of all of this, there was a war going on. In 1688, a conflict that became known as King William's War broke out between the English colonies and the French colonies of New France and her indigenous allies. This was technically a North American outgrowth of a European conflict known as the 9 Years' War. But for the colonists in New England, most of the fighting was with the indigenous group known as the Wabanaki Confederacy, who were allied with the French. Between 1688 and 1692, the Wabanaki, assisted by the French, orchestrated a number of highly effective and deadly raids into Maine, New Hampshire, and other parts of the New England frontier. For most of the early part of the war, the Wabanaki Confederacy were consistently getting the better of the English colonists. Even in peacetime, the idea of a raid by indigenous people was the stuff of colonial nightmares. But during King William's War, the threat was very real. As we will see when we start examining the personalities involved in the Salem witch crisis, many of the key figures had personally experienced the violence of King William's War. So, let's look at all of the ingredients here. The super religious powers at be in this society feel like they've been on the back foot for at least 3 years, and they've just managed to wrestle back some power. They have no idea how long they will be able to keep that power, and they've become convinced that God has forsaken the colony. They believe the only solution is sincere repentance and a crackdown on sin. Harvests have been poor and weather-related disasters more common. There's also a persistent anxiety that the colony might be attacked at any time by the Wabanaki Confederacy. So, imagine now, you're a Puritan minister in the Massachusetts town of Salem Village. The future of your colony is in flux. The harvest has not been good. At any moment, an invading force of French and Wabanaki might sweep through and murder your family, and you feel fairly certain that God is rendering his righteous judgment on your community for its many sins. Then your 9-year-old daughter comes in the room. She has a faraway look in her eye. Then she starts twisting into strange postures and babbling incoherently before crawling under a chair and barking like a dog. It might be just enough to make someone snap. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will continue our series on the Salem Witch Trials. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that on November 4th, I am going to be speaking at the Intelligent Speech conference. It's an online conference. Head to intelligentspeechonline.com to get tickets. It's going to be awesome. Going to be doing a keynote speech, going to be doing a roundtable with Daniele Bolelli. There's going to be a lot of other great history podcasters there in attendance. If you're into history podcasts, you got to check out Intelligent Speech. As always, before we go, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Alexandra Sipe, to Charlie Murphy, to Avery Katz, to Justin Gomez, to Tony A, to Chad Nui, to Eric Ward, to Strayona, to Truls Slevgen, to Connor Mann, to Beau Montier, to Heinrich Beisheim, and to Murdy Mern. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They're beautiful human beings. Thank you for all your support. Thank you to everyone supporting at all levels. And if you want to support in a nice, simple way and get yourself a little treat, maybe check out our TeePublic store. We've got some new designs coming. The votes are in, and very soon we will have the new designs up in the TeePublic store. Just go to teepublic.com/store/our-fake-history. But if that's too complicated, just go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link to the store. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always send me a message at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me at ourfakehistory on Twitter. You can find me at ourfakehistory on Instagram. You can find me at ourfakehistory on TikTok. And I'm also on YouTube. We got those YouTube videos out there now, so don't sleep on those. They're fun. I feel like I'm getting better at them. I don't know. You be the judge. As always, the theme song for our show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
Two sisters, one a respected TV producer, Jill Blackstone, and the other, Wendy. She was disabled, nearly blind and deaf, and Jill had devoted herself to taking care of Wendy.
Jill was her best friend, her sister, her everything.
But the sister bond was shattered when Wendy and some of the sisters' rescue dogs were found dead in a garage next to a toppled-over barbecue grill. Jill says accidental carbon monoxide poisoning killed everyone. Police do not believe her.
Police arrested Jill Blackstone for the murder of her sister.
Investigators think it was staged to look like an accident.
Who will you believe, especially now that a secret source has come forward with evidence never made public before?
Jill was a good producer. There's no doubt about that. But would she produce murder is the question.
Season 2 of Bad Bad Thing, The Blackstone Sisters, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
I always say, show me a perfect family. I'll show you a family with secrets.